A crisp autumn morning broke over the vast wilderness of the national park. Golden light spilled through the towering pines, casting long shadows across the dew-covered meadows. The air carried the earthy scent of decaying leaves and pine needles, mingled with the faint trace of wood smoke from distant campfires. It was the kind of morning that reminded the park ranger why he had dedicated nearly 2 decades of his life to protecting this wilderness. The ranger moved with practiced efficiency through his morning routine at the small outpost station. 52 years old now, with weather-beaten features that spoke of countless days spent under the open sky, he embodied the quiet authority that came from intimate knowledge of the land. His movements were deliberate, economical, the habits of a man who had learned to conserve energy for when it truly mattered. The crow's feet around his eyes deepened when he squinted at the horizon, assessing the day ahead with the instinctive forecasting ability that only comes from years of observation. He poured coffee into a battered thermos, the same one he'd carried for 12 years, ever since his daughter had given it to him on Father's Day. The thought of his family brought a momentary softness to his otherwise stoic expression. They lived in the small town just beyond the park's eastern entrance, close enough to visit on his days off, but distant enough that the separation sometimes ached like an old injury. His wife understood his devotion to the wilderness. She'd married him knowing the park was as much a part of him as his own heartbeat. Their 2 children had grown up with stories of the wild, weekend camping trips, and the unspoken understanding that their father belonged partly to something greater than himself. The ranger had not always worn the uniform. Before this, he'd served overseas, military service that had left him with nightmares he never discussed, and a discipline that served him well in the backcountry. The transition from soldier to guardian of the wilderness had been his salvation, a purpose found when he'd needed it most. The park had healed something broken inside him, and in return, he gave it his unwavering protection. Stepping outside, he inhaled deeply, cataloging the morning's sensory information. Temperature, mid-40s, dropping from overnight. Wind, light from the northwest. Moisture level, high, with heavy dew indicating clear night skies. Everything was as it should be, and yet, something felt off. The ranger paused, head tilted slightly, listening. The dawn chorus of birdsong seemed muted today, the usual cacophony reduced to sporadic calls. In the distance, a crow gave its harsh alarm call 3 times before falling silent. The ranger's eyes narrowed. Years of experience had taught him to trust these subtle warnings from the wilderness. He loaded his gear methodically into the Park Service vehicle, standard equipment for backcountry patrol. Radio, first aid kit, maps, GPS, binoculars, wildlife deterrent. His hand hesitated over the sidearm he rarely carried but decided against it. Whatever had unsettled the wildlife was likely natural. Perhaps a mountain lion had moved through recently, or a bear was foraging nearby. The ranger pulled away from the outpost, tires crunching on the gravel road. His patrol today would take him along the northwestern boundary, a remote section of the park where visitor traffic was minimal, especially in the off-season. It was one of his favorite areas, untamed wilderness with minimal human impact, where the landscape remained much as it had been for centuries. As he drove, the ranger noted more unusual signs. A herd of elk, normally grazing peacefully in the early morning meadows, stood bunched together at the forest edge, alert and watchful. A fox crossed the road ahead of him, moving with uncharacteristic haste. The wilderness was speaking, but the message remained unclear. The ranger switched off the engine at a small turnout, deciding to continue on foot. The trail ahead wound through dense forest before opening onto a series of small alpine meadows. He'd walked this route hundreds of times over the years, knew every switchback and vista point. The familiarity should have been comforting, but today it only heightened his awareness of subtle differences. The forest was too quiet. The usual rustle of small creatures in the underbrush was absent. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath among the towering pines. The ranger moved with increased caution, each step deliberate, senses heightened. Years of training, both military and wilderness, had conditioned him to recognize the warning signs of danger, even when he couldn't yet identify the threat. He checked his watch. 0730 hours. The morning patrols would be checking in soon, rangers scattered across the vast territory reporting conditions in their sectors. The radio at his hip remained silent for now. Whatever strangeness he was sensing seemed localized to this remote section of the park. The ranger paused at the edge of a small clearing, something catching his trained eye. Tire tracks, fresh ones, cutting through the underbrush where no authorized vehicle should be. He crouched down, examining the impression. not the typical tread pattern of park vehicles or the recreational vehicles allowed on designated roads. These were deeper, more aggressive, military grade, or close to it. He straightened, following the path of disturbed vegetation with his eyes. Whatever had made these tracks had forced its way through approximately 50 yards of dense undergrowth before disappearing into a thicket of young pines. Unauthorized vehicle access was a serious violation of park regulations, especially in restricted wilderness areas. But this felt like more than a simple case of tourist misbehavior. The ranger moved cautiously toward the thicket, noting how the branches had been broken and pushed aside. Whatever had come through here had been in a hurry, with little regard for concealment. His hand went automatically to the radio at his belt, then hesitated. Better to assess the situation fully before calling it in. The dense stand of young pines gave way suddenly to a small, natural depression in the landscape, a hollow perhaps 20 feet across, ringed by larger trees and largely hidden from casual observation. In the center of this natural hiding place sat a military jeep, its olive-drab paint scheme dulled by dust and scratches. The ranger's pulse quickened. Military vehicles had no business being in this section of the park. There were designated areas for interagency operations, and any legitimate military presence would have been coordinated through park administration, which meant he would have been briefed. Moving closer, he noted details with the automatic precision of his training. The vehicle showed signs of hard use. Mud caked on the undercarriage, several dents along the body panels, a cracked windshield, no visible registration numbers or clear military branch insignia. The tires matched the tracks he'd observed. Recent arrival, within the last 24 hours based on the freshness of the broken vegetation. The ranger circled the vehicle once, maintaining distance, looking for any immediate signs of occupants. The Jeep sat empty, parked at an odd angle as if it had been hastily positioned. The driver's side door hung slightly ajar. He approached with caution, years of military and law enforcement training guiding his movements. His hand rested near his radio, ready to call for backup if necessary. The only sounds were his own careful footsteps and the distant call of a raven. Standing beside the vehicle now, the ranger could see through the driver's window. The interior was Spartan, as expected for a military vehicle, but several details immediately registered as unusual. The dashboard had been modified with non-standard equipment, black boxes with blinking lights, and what appeared to be a specialized communication system. A map was spread across the passenger seat, marked with notations he couldn't decipher from this angle. The ranger's instincts screamed caution, but professional responsibility drove him forward. He needed to determine if this represented a security threat to the park or its visitors. He pulled a pair of nitrile gloves from his pocket, standard procedure when investigating potential evidence, and slipped them on before carefully pulling the driver's door fully open. The smell hit him first, metallic and organic, unmistakable to anyone with combat experience. Blood. The ranger's body reacted before his conscious mind could process what he was seeing. His heart hammered against his ribs. His breath caught painfully in his throat. A cold sweat broke out across his forehead and back as adrenaline flooded his system. The passenger footwell contained a military-style duffel bag, partially unzipped. Protruding from the opening was a human hand, pale and lifeless, the wrist bearing a distinctive tattoo of military insignia. Dark blood had pooled and congealed on the rubber floor mat, soaking into the canvas of the bag. The ranger stepped back involuntarily, years of training momentarily overwhelmed by the shock of the discovery. He'd seen death before, both in combat and occasionally in the park, hiking accidents, exposure cases, even wildlife attacks. But this was different. This had the hallmarks of deliberate violence. Regaining his composure with an effort of will, he forced himself to look more carefully, cataloging details with professional detachment. The blood pattern suggested the victim had been placed in the vehicle after death. The volume indicated fatal trauma. No obvious weapon visible. The vehicle's interior otherwise showed minimal signs of struggle. The ranger's mind raced through protocols and jurisdictions. A dead body meant homicide investigation. Military vehicle meant potential federal involvement. Location in the national park added another layer of complexity. He reached for his radio, then stopped as his eye caught something on the dashboard he'd missed before. A small, leather-bound notebook, military issue by the looks of it, with a folded paper protruding from between the pages. Professional curiosity warred with procedure. He should secure the scene and call it in immediately. But something about this situation felt wrong beyond the obvious presence of a corpse. The remote location. the military vehicle with non-standard modifications, the absence of official notification of operations in the area. Decision made, the ranger carefully reached for the notebook, using his gloved hand to flip it open to where the paper was inserted. The page revealed coordinates, locations within the park, accompanied by timestamps for the coming week. The folded paper contained what appeared to be schematics, though for what, he couldn't immediately determine. What was clear was that this was no ordinary military operation. The ranger quickly photographed the notebook pages and the vehicle interior with his department-issued camera. Documentation was critical, especially given the jurisdictional complications that would inevitably arise. He carefully replaced the notebook exactly as he'd found it. Stepping back from the vehicle, he finally keyed his radio. "Base, this is Ranger 37. I've got an 1054 at grid coordinates Echo 59. Military vehicle, unauthorized access, 1 confirmed 10 to 55. Requesting immediate assistance and scene security. Over." The radio crackled. "Ranger 37 base. Confirmed 1054 with 1055. Are you certain about military vehicle presence?" Over. Affirmative base. Military jeep, non-standard modifications. Single casualty confirmed. Scene appears staged. Request law enforcement response and potential federal notification. Over. Stand by, Ranger 37. The ranger waited, knowing the length of the pause reflected the unusual nature of his report. Unauthorized military presence with a fatality would trigger multiple response protocols. Ranger 37, maintain scene security. Nearest law enforcement unit is 45 minutes out. Do not approach further or disturb potential evidence. Deputy Chief is being notified. Maintain radio contact. Over. Understood, base. Will secure perimeter and await response. Out. The ranger knew that simply standing guard was insufficient. While waiting for backup, he could gather critical information that might be lost once multiple agencies descended on the scene. He returned to his pack, retrieving additional documentation equipment, evidence markers, measuring tape, and his digital camera with telephoto lens. From a respectful distance that wouldn't disturb the immediate scene, he began systematically photographing the area surrounding the vehicle. The ground told its own story. Multiple boot prints of at least 3 distinct patterns and sizes. One set matched the standard issue for park personnel, though the ranger was certain no staff had reported presence in this area recently. He documented tire tracks, broken vegetation, and a concerning detail, what appeared to be items deliberately concealed under forest debris approximately 15 yards from the vehicle. Using a long stick rather than his hands to gently move aside the covering of leaves and branches, he uncovered a cache of equipment. A military-grade communication device, several canteens, and a sealed waterproof container. The ranger photographed everything in place, his unease growing. This had the hallmarks of an operation rather than an isolated incident. The dead individual in the vehicle might be just one element of something larger. His training urged caution, but his responsibility to the park and its visitors demanded thorough investigation. Using a fallen branch to carefully lift the waterproof container's edge, he was able to see documents inside, maps similar to the one in the vehicle, but with more extensive markings indicating locations throughout the park's northwestern quadrant. The ranger's mind worked through the implications. The markings corresponded with critical infrastructure, water supply points, communication towers, main access roads. This was beginning to look like surveillance for something more sinister. He carefully returned everything to its original position, adding more thorough documentation to his growing evidence file. By the time backup arrived, he would have a comprehensive preliminary assessment. A sound in the distance, the distinctive crack of a branch underfoot, froze him in place. Someone was approaching through the forest, moving with purpose but making no effort at stealth. The ranger melted back into the tree line, positioning himself to observe without being seen. 2 figures emerged from the forest on the opposite side of the clearing. Men in civilian hiking clothes that didn't quite conceal their military bearing. They moved with the coordination of those accustomed to working together, communicating with hand signals rather than words as they approached the jeep. The ranger raised his camera, using the telephoto lens to capture clear images of the men. Their reaction upon reaching the vehicle told a story of its own. Surprise, followed by urgent, whispered consultation. This was not part of their plan. After a brief inspection of the vehicle's interior, the men retreated the way they had come, moving with greater haste. The ranger continued documenting until they disappeared from view, then waited several minutes to ensure they weren't doubling back. When his radio crackled again, he reported the new development. Base, Ranger 37. Be advised, 2 unidentified individuals just inspected the vehicle and departed heading northwest. Subjects appear military trained but in civilian clothing. Requesting aerial support if available. Over. Copy Ranger 37. Law enforcement ETA now 30 minutes. Park chief has been notified and is conferring with federal authorities. Continue observation only. Do not engage. Over. Understood, base. Out. The ranger checked his watch. 30 minutes until backup arrived. He used the time to continue his documentation, maintaining a vigilant watch for the return of the unidentified men. When the first park law enforcement vehicle arrived, followed closely by the county sheriff's deputy, the ranger provided a comprehensive briefing. He handed over his camera with the photographic evidence and led them to the vehicle and the concealed equipment cache. The sheriff's deputy, a gruff veteran with 25 years of local law enforcement experience, seemed skeptical despite the evidence before him. Military operations gone wrong? Not our jurisdiction. We'll secure the scene until the feds arrive, but this is above my pay grade. The park law enforcement officer was more concerned. If there's unauthorized military activity in the park, we need to know what they're doing. This could pose a threat to visitors. The ranger outlined his observations and concerns. The maps indicate surveillance of critical park infrastructure. Combined with the communication equipment and the fatality, this suggests something more organized than a simple trespassing case. The deputy shrugged. Could be training exercise gone wrong. Military does stupid stuff all the time. We'll let the feds sort it out. When will they arrive? The ranger asked. Tomorrow morning at the earliest. They're sending a team from the regional office. The ranger's concern deepened. And until then, we maintain scene security, standard procedure. Nothing else we can do. The deputy's tone made it clear the discussion was over. As the sun began to set, the ranger was finally relieved from the scene. He provided his written report, surrendered copies of all evidence, and was instructed to return to normal duties pending further investigation. The official response was underway, following protocols and jurisdictional handoffs with bureaucratic precision. Driving back to his outpost in the gathering darkness, the ranger couldn't shake the feeling that something crucial was being missed. The methodical placement of the body in the jeep, the deliberately concealed equipment, the maps marking critical infrastructure. The 2 men who clearly hadn't expected to find a corpse in their vehicle. Back at his small station, he reviewed his own notes, separate from the official report. The coordinates from the notebook, the timestamps for the coming days, the schematics he hadn't recognized. Sleep proved elusive that night. The ranger lay awake, staring at the ceiling of his modest quarters, mind racing through possibilities. Training exercise gone wrong? Possible, but unlikely given the lack of official notification. Criminal activity? The military equipment suggested otherwise. Rogue operation? The most concerning possibility. By dawn, he had made his decision. Official channels would move too slowly, bound by jurisdictions and protocols. If his suspicions were correct, there wasn't time to wait. Whatever was happening in his park, his responsibility, required immediate attention. The ranger rose before first light, gathering specialized equipment rarely needed for routine patrols. If official investigation would wait for federal authorities, he would conduct his own reconnaissance in the meantime. After all, knowing every inch of the territory was his job. That he might encounter unauthorized personnel during his regular patrol routes was simply a possibility he needed to be prepared for. As the first hint of sunrise touched the eastern sky, the ranger headed out, his official patrol schedule providing the perfect cover for a more focused investigation. Whatever was happening in his park, he would discover the truth before it was too late. Dawn painted the eastern sky in hues of amber and gold as the ranger drove toward the small town that served as the park's eastern gateway. His official schedule listed him for administrative duties, paperwork that could justify his presence in town without raising questions. The dashboard clock read 6:17 a.m. Most municipal offices wouldn't open until 9, giving him time to prepare. At a roadside diner frequented by park employees, the ranger nursed a cup of black coffee while reviewing his notes. He'd transferred the coordinates from the military notebook to his own topographical maps, creating a constellation of points across the park's northwestern quadrant. The pattern suggested systematic coverage of something, monitoring stations perhaps, or collection points. Whatever their purpose, the precision of their placement indicated professional planning. The ranger's weathered fingers traced lines between the points, searching for meaning in their arrangement. 20 years in the park had given him intimate knowledge of the terrain, and something about these locations nagged at his memory. They seemed to correlate with something he'd seen before, but the connection remained elusive. When the county records office opened at 9, the ranger was waiting. The building, a squat brick structure from the 1970s, housed the region's historical archives, property records, and municipal documentation, a place where the past was filed and forgotten, tended by those who preferred the company of paper to people. The records clerk glanced up from her computer with a universal look of bureaucratic disinterest, a gaze that traveled from the ranger's official ID to his face and back again without curiosity. County archives and records. How can I assist you today? Her tone suggested assistance was a technical requirement rather than a personal inclination. The ranger explained his request with practiced casualness. Research for the park's Resource Management Office. We're updating historical land use documentation for the northwestern section. The lie came easily, wrapped in enough procedural jargon to sound legitimate. Time period. The clerk's fingers hovered over her keyboard. Primarily 1950 through 1980, though anything earlier or later would be helpful. The clerk's eyebrows lifted slightly, the first hint of actual interest. The restricted sections? The ranger maintained his neutral expression despite the spike of curiosity her words triggered. Is that what they were called? That's what my predecessor called them. She shrugged. Before my time. Those records are still being digitized, so you'll need to use the physical archives in the basement. She handed him a visitor badge. Section H12 through H17. Sign the logbook before you leave. The basement archives smelled of dust and aging paper, a museum of forgotten bureaucracy. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting a clinical glow over rows of metal shelving. The ranger navigated to Section H, finding the numbered ranges that contained the records he sought. For 2 hours he methodically worked through folders and bound volumes, photographing relevant pages with his phone. Property acquisitions by the federal government in the 1950s. Land use designations. Correspondence between park administration and various military branches. Environmental impact assessments with curious redactions. In a water-stained folder dated 1962, he found the first solid connection. A memo from the Department of Defense to the park superintendent, requesting temporary access to designated monitoring stations, following what was described only as atmospheric testing activities. Attached was a map, yellowed with age but still legible, showing locations that corresponded with alarming precision to the coordinates from the military notebook. The ranger's pulse quickened. He photographed the document, then continued his search with renewed focus. A bound report from 1968 provided the next piece of the puzzle. A geological survey commissioned by a department with an acronym he didn't recognize, ATSRP. The study focused on groundwater movement and soil composition in specific areas that aligned with the coordinates. Several sections were heavily redacted, but one paragraph caught his attention. Following Incident 17B, contamination levels at monitoring stations 3, 7, and 12 showed elevated readings inconsistent with background radiation. Recommend continued monitoring and restricted access protocols for minimum 50-year duration. The ranger sat back, processing the implications. Radiation, contamination, monitoring stations, a classified incident. The puzzle was taking shape, but critical pieces remained missing. His next discovery came from an unexpected source, a locally published history book titled Our County, A Photographic Journey. Among images of town development and local celebrations was a photograph dated 1965, a military convoy moving along a remote park road, carrying equipment draped with tarps. The caption simply read, Military conducts routine exercises in the park region, 1965. But there was nothing routine about military convoys in national parks, especially during the height of the Cold War. By noon, the ranger had assembled enough historical context to justify his next step. According to county property records, the federal government had acquired land approximately 12 miles outside the park's northwestern boundary in 1960. The property was listed as decommissioned in 1972, with ownership transferred to the Bureau of Land Management. No specific purpose was documented, but the timing aligned perfectly with the monitoring station documentation. The ranger thanked the records clerk, signed out, and returned to his vehicle. The decommissioned facility wasn't on his official patrol route, but it wasn't far from park boundaries. A detour could be explained if necessary. 40 minutes of driving brought him to an unmarked gravel road, barely visible from the main highway. No signs indicated federal property, but the ranger recognized the subtle markers of government land, the specific type of fencing, the particular arrangement of boundary markers. He parked in a natural pullout and continued on foot, moving with the quiet efficiency that had become second nature after decades in the wilderness. The facility emerged from the landscape like a forgotten ruin, a series of low concrete structures partially reclaimed by nature. Chain-link fencing, rusted and sagging in places, surrounded a compound roughly the size of a football field. Warning signs. Their red lettering faded to a ghostly pink, still proclaimed U.S. government property, no trespassing, and authorized personnel only. The ranger circled the perimeter, photographing the facility from multiple angles. What had once been a security gate hung askew from broken hinges. Nature had begun the slow process of reclamation. Pine saplings pushing through cracked asphalt, wildflowers blooming between concrete slabs. A fox den dug beneath one of the smaller outbuildings. Finding a section of fence that had collapsed entirely, the ranger entered the compound. His caution was habitual rather than specific. The place had the unmistakable feel of long abandonment. The main building's windows were shattered, its metal door hanging open like a broken jaw. Inside, the ranger found what he expected: emptiness. Whatever equipment or documentation had once existed here had been removed long ago. But the structure itself told a story. Thick concrete walls, special ventilation systems, reinforced sublevels accessible via a metal staircase. The design spoke of containment, of isolation. This hadn't been merely administrative, it had been operational. In what appeared to have been a control room, metal frames stood empty where monitoring equipment had once been mounted. Faded labels still adhered to some surfaces, their technical terminology confirming his suspicions. Radiation levels, atmospheric sampling, groundwater testing. On the far wall, barely visible beneath years of dust and grime, hung a large map of the region. The ranger carefully wiped away the accumulated filth with his handkerchief, revealing familiar topography. Red pins had once been placed at specific locations, though most had fallen to the floor over the decades. The few that remained corresponded exactly with the coordinates from the military notebook. The ranger documented everything methodically, building his case with the precision his military training had instilled. By the time he left the abandoned facility, the lengthening shadows indicated late afternoon. He had what he needed: historical context that transformed random coordinates into something coherent, a network of monitoring stations for radiation contamination, established decades ago and supposedly abandoned. Except someone was revisiting them now, with military precision and deadly consequences. Pre-dawn darkness still clung to the landscape as the ranger prepared for his return to the original discovery site. He'd spent much of the night reviewing his findings, connecting historical documentation with current evidence. The picture emerging was troubling: a decades-old monitoring network for radiation contamination, officially decommissioned but potentially being reactivated for unknown purposes. Today's official patrol schedule had him checking the northwestern boundary, close enough to justify his presence near the original site. He packed additional equipment: a personal GPS unit, a higher resolution camera than his department-issue one, a small radiation detector purchased years ago during training for hazardous materials response, and a satellite phone that wouldn't route through park communication systems. The ranger drove as far as regulations permitted, then continued on foot, moving with the silent efficiency of someone who had spent decades navigating wilderness. Morning mist clung to the forest floor, wrapping around tree trunks and obscuring the distance. The effect was both beautiful and isolating, a natural shroud that concealed his approach but might similarly hide others. Rather than approach the jeep site directly, the ranger circled wide, establishing a perimeter and scanning for signs of surveillance or recent activity. The scene had changed since his last visit. The jeep was gone. Expected, given that law enforcement had been processing the scene. But something else nagged at his experienced eye. The forest felt different, disturbed in subtle ways that most would miss. Someone had been here recently, and they hadn't been following official protocols. The ranger documented the changes. Evidence markers moved or missing. New boot prints that didn't match standard issue for park law enforcement or county sheriff personnel. Branches broken in a pattern consistent with equipment being carried through the underbrush. Following these signs, he discovered what he suspected. The official investigation had ended prematurely. The equipment cache he had documented had been removed, not by law enforcement but by someone else, someone who knew exactly where to look and what to retrieve. More concerning were the fresh tracks leading away from the scene, not back toward established roads but deeper into restricted wilderness areas. The ranger followed, maintaining caution and documenting his route. The tracks led approximately 2 miles northwest, ascending a ridge that overlooked a remote valley rarely visited even by park personnel. At the ridge's crest, the ranger found what the military team had been so intent on keeping secret. Concealed within a natural rock formation, invisible from casual observation, was an entrance, a metal door set into the hillside, secured with modern locking mechanisms that contrasted sharply with the weathered exterior. The ranger photographed the entrance from multiple angles, recording GPS coordinates and surrounding landmarks. This was no temporary monitoring station. This was infrastructure, permanent and purposeful, hidden in one of the most remote sections of the park. With the caution born of experience, he examined the door without touching it. No obvious security cameras, but the lock appeared to be electronic, requiring keycard access. The design was military standard, the same type he'd seen on secure facilities during his service years. This was no civilian operation. The ranger retreated to a concealed observation point with clear sight lines to the entrance, settling in to watch. For 3 hours, nothing changed. No personnel entered or exited. No vehicles approached. The forest maintained its peaceful rhythm around the incongruous human insertion. Just as he was considering withdrawal, movement caught his attention. The metal door opened and 2 individuals emerged. The same men he had observed at the Jeep site, still in civilian hiking clothing that failed to conceal their military bearing. They carried equipment cases and what appeared to be testing devices, moving with purpose rather than caution. The ranger documented their activities from his concealed position. They set up what looked like environmental sampling equipment at specific intervals around the entrance, taking readings and collecting specimens. Their efficiency spoke of training and familiarity with the protocols. This was routine for them, part of an ongoing operation. When they disappeared back into the hillside entrance, the ranger made his move. Approaching the sampling locations, he photographed the equipment up close without disturbing it. The devices were sophisticated, far beyond standard environmental monitoring. Some displayed reading outputs that confirmed his suspicions: radiation levels, atmospheric composition, particulate analysis. One device was particularly concerning, a monitor displaying fluctuating readings in millisieverts, the unit used to measure radiation exposure. The current reading was low but detectable, suggesting something inside the facility was emitting radiation. The ranger recorded everything, transferring photos and notes to multiple devices to ensure redundancy. Whatever was happening here went far beyond unauthorized access or routine military exercises. This was active monitoring of something potentially hazardous, hidden within a national park and outside official oversight. As he prepared to withdraw, a final discovery cemented his concerns. At the base of a tree near the entrance, partially concealed by rocks, he found a military-issue tablet, apparently dropped or forgotten by one of the operatives. The device was locked, but its exterior case bore the same insignia he had observed on the dead man's tattoo, a stylized eagle with the letters ATSRP, the same acronym from the historical documents. The connection was undeniable. The ranger secured the tablet in his pack and retreated, carefully covering his tracks as he departed the area. By the time he returned to his vehicle, the afternoon was waning. He had what he needed: evidence of current military operations at a concealed facility, environmental testing for radiation, and a direct connection to both the historical monitoring program and the dead man in the Jeep. Something dangerous was happening in his park, and no one in authority seemed interested in investigating. The ranger's small outpost cabin felt different when he returned that evening. Nothing visibly disturbed, nothing obviously missing, yet something had changed. 20 years in the wilderness had honed his senses to detect the subtlest variations in his environment. Someone had been here. He moved through the space methodically, checking for signs of intrusion. The door had been professionally picked, microscopic scratches on the lock mechanism that wouldn't be visible to anyone without training and a flashlight. File cabinets showed similar signs of examination. His personal laptop remained untouched, a deliberate choice by someone smart enough to know tampering would be detected. On his desk calendar, previously showing the current month, a single addition stood out in handwriting not his own: Cease investigation. Final warning. The message was as clear as it was concerning. Not only was he under surveillance, but whoever was watching had easy access to his personal space and professional documentation. They knew what he was investigating, and they wanted it stopped. The ranger photographed the message, then carefully removed the calendar page, securing it as evidence. A thorough check of the outpost revealed no surveillance devices. Either they were exceptionally well concealed, or his watchers were confident enough not to need constant monitoring. More concerning was the discovery that his vehicle had been tampered with. A quick inspection revealed brake lines that had been partially cut, not enough to fail immediately, but enough to potentially rupture during extended use or on rough terrain. A potentially fatal sabotage designed to appear accidental. The ranger repaired the damage himself, then checked other critical systems. His satellite phone had been disabled, the internal components expertly damaged in a way that wouldn't be immediately apparent. His official radio remained functional, but that only confirmed his suspicion that official communication channels might be compromised. Rather than return to the outpost that night, the ranger drove to a designated emergency shelter within the park, a location known to park personnel but not marked on public maps. From there, he used a prepaid mobile phone purchased months ago for emergencies to make a call to park headquarters. This is Ranger 37 requesting meeting with Chief Ranger regarding case file November Echo 7, Priority Alpha. The dispatcher's voice revealed confusion. Ranger 37, I don't show any active case with that designation. The Jeep incident, military vehicle with casualty. A pause. That case has been transferred to federal jurisdiction, closed at our level. Who authorized closure? Another pause. Longer this time. Orders came through the regional director's office yesterday morning. All evidence transferred to federal custody. No further Park Service involvement authorized. The ranger absorbed this information, its implications clear. Less than 48 hours after discovery, the case had been classified and removed from local jurisdiction. Someone with significant authority wanted this buried quickly. Copy that. Cancel meeting request. Ranger 37 out. The next morning, the ranger made his second attempt with authorities. Rather than going through park administration, he drove to the county sheriff's office, requesting a meeting with the deputy who had responded to the original scene. The deputy's reaction was unexpectedly hostile. Case is closed, Ranger. Feds took jurisdiction. Did they explain why? Military operations in the park? Military trains all over. Nothing unusual. The deputy's eyes didn't meet his. Some training exercise got out of hand. They're handling it internally, not our business. There was a dead body, deputy. That makes it our business. Feds say it was one of theirs. Internal matter. We've been instructed to stay clear. The deputy finally looked directly at him. Strongly instructed. Understand? The implication was clear. Pressure had been applied from above, and the local authorities had folded. Whether through jurisdiction, intimidation, or outright corruption, the system had been neutralized. As the ranger turned to leave, a younger officer, barely out of the academy by the look of him, caught his eye and made a subtle gesture toward the hallway. The ranger nodded almost imperceptibly and exited the building. 5 minutes later, the young officer emerged, glancing around nervously before approaching the ranger's vehicle. You're the one who found the military jeep, he said, his voice low. With the body. The ranger nodded, waiting. You're not the first one to find something out there. The young officer shifted his weight anxiously. My uncle was park maintenance. 15 years ago. Found some kind of monitoring equipment up near that same ridge. Started asking questions. What happened? Transferred suddenly. Then accident on his new job. Industrial equipment failure, they said. The young officer's eyes revealed his disbelief in the official story. Before that happened, he told my dad something was wrong out there. Something the government was hiding. The ranger considered the young man carefully. Why tell me this? Because they're watching you now. Just like they watched him. He glanced toward the sheriff's office. Deputy chief got a call yesterday from someone claiming to be FBI. No badge number provided, no official follow-up. Just a call telling us to back off and forget what we saw. That's not protocol. Exactly. The young officer handed him a folded paper. My uncle's notes, locations he found suspicious, might help. The ranger accepted the paper. This could put your job at risk. A grim smile. Some things matter more than jobs, sir. Be careful out there. Back in his vehicle, the ranger examined the paper, hand-drawn maps marking locations that corresponded with alarming precision to both the historical documentation and the coordinates from the military notebook. This had been going on for decades, with anyone who noticed being silenced or discredited. When he returned to his emergency shelter that afternoon, a second warning awaited him. His emergency pack, always kept in the shelter, had been opened. Inside, placed atop his equipment, was a printed photograph of him entering the county records office, time-stamped from the previous day. On the back, written in the same handwriting as the calendar note, "We see everything. Final warning." The escalation was significant. Not only were they monitoring his movements across multiple locations, but they wanted him to know the extent of their surveillance. Psychological intimidation, a tactic he recognized from military operations. That evening, as he organized his evidence and prepared his next move, headlights swept across the shelter windows. A vehicle had pulled up outside, unusual given the shelter's unmarked status and remote location. The ranger doused the lights and moved to a defensive position, service weapon drawn. The sound of footsteps approached. A single individual moving directly to the door. A sharp knock followed. "Park ranger, I know you're in there." A male voice, unfamiliar. "We need to talk." The ranger remained silent, weapon trained on the door. "I'm unarmed. I'm alone." A pause. "I know about the radiation monitoring stations. I know about ATSRP. And I know you're in danger." Still, the ranger waited. The man in the Jeep was my colleague. He was bringing me evidence when they caught up with him. Another pause. "I'm with the Environmental Protection Agency, Office of Inspector General. We've been investigating this for months." The claim was plausible but unverified. The ranger maintained his position. "Look, I don't blame you for being cautious, but time is critical. If you found what I think you have, a lot of lives could be at risk." The voice lowered. "Including yours." A business card slid under the door. Official EPA credentials with a name and contact information. "Call the main EPA office if you want to verify my identity. Ask for the Inspector General's office. Then call my cell when you're ready to talk. I'll be at the motel in town." Footsteps retreated. The vehicle started and drove away. The ranger retrieved the card, examining it under his flashlight. It appeared legitimate, but in his current situation, trust was a luxury he couldn't afford. He would verify the man's identity before any contact. That night, the ranger methodically organized all evidence he had gathered: historical documents, photographs, coordinates, the young officer's map, warning notes, and the military tablet. He created 3 complete sets, encrypting the digital files and securing physical evidence in waterproof containers. One set would remain hidden near the emergency shelter. One would be mailed to a former military colleague he trusted implicitly, someone outside local influence with connections to federal oversight committees. The third he would keep with him. His next step was clear. If local authorities were compromised and official channels blocked, he needed to elevate the issue beyond regional control. The EPA investigator might be legitimate or might be another attempt to identify and contain his investigation. Verification was essential before proceeding. Beyond that, the ranger had identified a national investigative journalist known for coverage of government accountability issues. Someone with resources to pursue the story and platform to make it impossible to bury. The initial contact was already drafted on his encrypted device. As dawn approached, the ranger reviewed his plans one final time. Someone was operating a potentially hazardous facility within park boundaries, outside official oversight. They had killed at least once to protect their secret and were actively monitoring and threatening anyone who came too close to the truth. Local authorities had been neutralized through official channels or intimidation. Against such odds, a lone park ranger might seem outmatched, but they had made a critical mistake in their assumptions. They saw him as an obstacle to be removed, not recognizing the fundamental truth that had defined his life. This was his park, his responsibility, his home, and he would protect it, no matter the cost. First light crept across the eastern horizon as the ranger methodically checked his equipment. Each item laid out on the emergency shelter's wooden table represented a carefully considered necessity for what might be his most dangerous patrol. 20 years of wilderness experience had taught him the value of preparation, but his military training emphasized an equally important truth: no plan survives first contact with the enemy. The ranger had verified the EPA investigator's credentials through official channels. The man was legitimate, a senior investigator with the Office of Inspector General, specializing in environmental crimes and regulatory violations. Their meeting the previous evening had confirmed what the ranger already suspected. Something extraordinarily dangerous was being concealed within the park's boundaries. They call it Project Cerberus, the investigator had explained, his voice low despite the precautions they'd taken against surveillance. Officially decommissioned in 1972, but my source discovered evidence of reactivation 3 months ago. Whatever they're monitoring has become active again. Active how? The ranger had asked. Radiation signatures consistent with degraded containment. My colleague, the man you found in the Jeep, was bringing me sampling data when he was intercepted. They made it look like an accident, but the message was clear. This investigation ends now. The ranger adjusted his tactical vest, checking each pocket for essential supplies. Water purification tablets, emergency medical kit, signal mirror, fire starters, compass, maps marked with escape routes. Extra ammunition for his service weapon, not standard for routine patrols, but this had moved far beyond routine. On the table beside his gear sat a sealed envelope addressed to the park's chief ranger, a detailed account of his investigation, including coordinates, historical documentation, and the connection to the military presence. If he didn't return, the evidence wouldn't die with him. His former military colleague had received the second evidence package yesterday, with instructions to release it to oversight committees if contact wasn't maintained for 48 hours. The ranger activated his personal GPS tracker, a device purchased years ago for backcountry expeditions, operating on satellite networks independent of local infrastructure. He'd configured it to log his position at 5-minute intervals, creating a breadcrumb trail that could be followed if necessary. A final addition to his pack was the military tablet recovered from the monitoring site. Though still locked, its presence alone was evidence of unauthorized operations. The EPA investigator had attempted to access it without success, but had photographed its exterior markings and serial numbers for verification against federal records. The ranger composed a brief video message on his personal device, addressing it to his family. He spoke in the measured tones of a man accustomed to risk but aware of mortality. If you're watching this, something went wrong. I need you to know this was necessary. What I've discovered threatens not just the park, but potentially everyone in the region. He paused, the weathered lines around his eyes deepening. I've done everything by the book until now, but the book isn't working anymore. You deserve to know why I had to go outside the system. He detailed the key elements of his investigation: the military jeep, the body, the radiation monitoring stations, the historical documentation of containment failure, the consistent pattern of obstruction from authorities. His voice remained steady, his language precise. This wasn't emotional testimony, but professional documentation from a man who had served both military and civilian authority for decades. The EPA investigator will contact you if necessary. Trust him. The evidence packages are already distributed. The truth will come out, with or without me. A final pause, the barest hint of emotion crossing his features. Take care of each other. I did what was necessary to protect what matters. The ranger encrypted the video and set it to automatically send if his tracking device remained stationary for more than 12 hours, a fail-safe against the worst-case scenario. As dawn fully illuminated the landscape, he made one final call to his most trusted colleague in the Park Service, a fellow ranger who had worked the Northwestern Territory for 15 years. I'm following up on that unauthorized access case, he explained without specifics. Might be off radio contact for 8-10 hours. If I don't check in by sunset, there's a package in my outpost desk for the chief, top right drawer, under the field manuals. Sounds serious, his colleague responded. Need backup? Not yet. Just coverage for my regular patrol route today. Consider it done. Watch yourself out there. The ranger ended the call, knowing he'd said both too much and not enough. Involving others directly would put them at risk, but ensuring the evidence survived was critical. He loaded his vehicle with practiced efficiency, then paused at the shelter door for a final survey of the wilderness beyond. The morning light painted the landscape in hues of amber and gold, the forest awakening with the calls of birds and the rustle of wildlife. This was what he had sworn to protect, not just the land itself, but the enduring promise that some places remained beyond exploitation, preserved for future generations. Whatever awaited him at the concealed facility, this moment of connection with the wilderness steadied his resolve. With a deep breath of pine-scented air, the ranger stepped outside and began what might be his final patrol. The ranger approached the concealed facility from an unexpected direction, abandoning established trails for a challenging route across rocky terrain that would leave minimal traces of his passage. Years of exploring the park's most remote areas had given him an intimate knowledge of approaches invisible to those who relied on maps and marked paths. By mid-morning, he had established an observation position on the ridge above the facility entrance, concealed among natural rock formations that provided both cover and elevated sightlines. Through high-powered binoculars, he documented increased activity. 3 individuals in unmarked tactical gear performing what appeared to be perimeter security sweeps, communication equipment being installed at regular intervals around the entrance. Whatever operation was underway had escalated since his last visit. The ranger settled in for systematic surveillance, photographing personnel, equipment, and security measures with the telescopic lens. 2 hours of observation revealed a pattern to the security rotations and a critical vulnerability. A 10-minute window when the rear approach remained unmonitored during shift changes. When that window next opened, the ranger moved with silent efficiency down the slope, using natural terrain features to mask his approach. The rear entrance, a secondary access point partially concealed by vegetation, had simpler security measures than the main door. A standard keycard reader likely connected to the same system. The ranger removed the military tablet from his pack, holding it near the card reader. His gamble was based on standard military security protocols. Equipment issued to authorized personnel typically included embedded access credentials. If the tablet belonged to someone with facility clearance, the lock mechanism emitted a soft click, followed by the hiss of a pressure seal releasing. Access granted. He slipped inside, immediately pressing himself against the wall as the door closed behind him. The interior was utilitarian: concrete walls, industrial lighting, air filtration systems humming steadily in the background. A military installation disguised as a monitoring station built directly into the hillside. The ranger documented everything as he moved deeper into the facility, following a sloping corridor that descended into the earth. Temperature dropped noticeably with each level. Humidity increased. The walls transitioned from concrete to natural stone reinforced with metal supports. Not a constructed building, but an adapted natural cavern system. At a junction he paused, hearing voices echoing from the left corridor. Instead, he took the right passage, descending further. The air quality changed subtly. A metallic taste, a faint odor reminiscent of electronics overheating. The ranger activated his personal radiation detector, noting readings elevated above background levels but not immediately dangerous. The corridor opened onto a cavernous space filled with monitoring equipment, computer terminals, and what appeared to be a central containment structure. A massive cylindrical chamber with reinforced walls, observation windows, and multiple security layers. Warning symbols for radiation, biohazards, and restricted access covered every surface. The ranger froze, processing the scene before him. This wasn't merely a monitoring station. This was a research facility, active, extensive, and completely unauthorized within national park boundaries. Moving with increased caution, he approached the nearest computer terminal, finding it unlocked. A security lapse suggesting the operators weren't expecting internal breaches. The screen displayed real-time monitoring data, including radiation levels, temperature fluctuations, and containment integrity metrics. All showed stable but elevated readings, with historical graphs indicating a significant spike approximately 3 months prior. The ranger photographed the displays, then navigated through the system files. Access to most areas required additional authentication, but overview documents remained available. What he found confirmed his worst fears. Project Cerberus hadn't been merely monitoring radiation from historical testing. They had been containing something. According to facility documentation, the original operation had involved experimental research during the Cold War. Attempts to develop enhanced radioactive materials with specific properties useful for both weapons and energy production. An incident in 1965 had resulted in the creation of an unexpectedly stable isotope with unusual properties, including self-perpetuating fission under certain conditions. Unable to safely transport or destroy the material, the military had constructed this facility to contain it indefinitely. Officially decommissioned in 1972, the site had actually remained operational under minimal staffing, monitored remotely through the station network. The ranger continued documenting, each discovery more disturbing than the last. Recent reports referenced containment degradation and increased activity levels following seismic events in the region. The operation he had stumbled upon wasn't military training or routine monitoring. It was emergency reactivation of a forgotten containment facility housing potentially catastrophic materials. A sudden alarm froze him in place, not facility-wide but localized to the terminal he was using. Someone had remotely detected the unauthorized access. The ranger quickly gathered his evidence and moved toward the exit, knowing his window of opportunity was closing rapidly. As he reached the corridor junction, voices approached from both directions, security personnel responding to the breach. The ranger ducked into a utility alcove, pressing himself into the shadows as footsteps passed. Full lockdown initiated, a voice reported over radio communications. All personnel to containment level. Possible contamination breach. The false alarm might buy him precious minutes. The ranger moved against the flow of responding personnel, using their focus on the perceived emergency to mask his own movement toward the exit. At the upper level, he encountered the first direct obstacle. 2 security personnel in tactical gear blocking the exit corridor, weapons drawn. No alternative route presented itself. The ranger assessed his options, recognizing that direct confrontation would escalate the situation beyond recovery. Instead, he accessed the nearby fire suppression controls, activating emergency protocols. Alarms blared throughout the facility as sprinkler systems engaged, creating instant chaos. In the confusion, the ranger moved quickly, using a utility access panel to bypass the guards and reach an emergency evacuation route. The secondary exit emerged onto the hillside 50 yards from the main entrance. A reinforced door designed for emergency evacuation, now automatically unlocked by the fire protocols. The ranger slipped outside into the afternoon sunlight, immediately moving into concealing vegetation. He had barely covered 20 yards when shouts erupted behind him. His escape had been detected. The ranger abandoned stealth for speed, using his intimate knowledge of the terrain to maximum advantage. Where his pursuers would see impassable slopes and dangerous terrain, he saw established game trails and natural movement corridors. The sounds of pursuit grew louder: crashing vegetation, radio communications, the mechanical sound of vehicles mobilizing. The ranger pushed deeper into the wilderness, his breathing controlled despite the exertion, each step calculated for both speed and minimal sign. A fallen tree provided momentary cover as he checked his position on the GPS unit. 3 miles from the nearest park trail, 5 from the emergency shelter where his vehicle waited. He plotted the most efficient route that would utilize terrain features to maximum advantage. A creek bed that would mask tracks, a rocky slope that would slow pursuers, a dense thicket that would force them to detour. As he moved again, the first shot cracked through the forest canopy, a warning rather than an aimed attempt. They wanted him alive, wanted to know what he'd discovered and who he'd told. That knowledge was his most significant advantage. The ranger pushed his pace, ignoring the burning in his lungs and the strain in his legs. Decades of wilderness experience had conditioned his body for exactly this kind of endurance. He crossed the creek at a natural stone formation, leaving minimal sign of his passage, then cut sharply uphill where dense vegetation would mask his trail. For 30 minutes the pursuit continued, professional, coordinated, but hampered by unfamiliarity with the terrain. The ranger used every natural feature to his advantage, creating false trails, doubling back, and utilizing techniques learned from both military training and years observing the park's wildlife. When he finally reached the emergency shelter, the sounds of pursuit had faded to distant echoes. The ranger quickly transferred the evidence to his vehicle, concealing the most critical documentation in compartments designed for emergency equipment. The GPS tracking data from his personal device was downloaded and encrypted, providing irrefutable proof of the facility's location and his own movements. Driving away from the shelter, the ranger monitored his surroundings for signs of pursuit. Standard roads would be watched. He opted instead for a maintenance access route, a rough fire road that connected to the park's eastern boundary through terrain too difficult for standard vehicles. His department-issued truck, modified for backcountry operations, handled the challenging conditions with reliable performance. As he cleared the park boundary, the ranger allowed himself the first deep breath since entering the facility. His hands trembled slightly on the steering wheel, the delayed response of adrenaline subsiding. But his mind remained clear, focused on the next critical phase. The evidence was secure, the documentation complete. Now came the most important part, ensuring it reached those who could act. The ranger selected the meeting location with strategic precision, a public diner adjacent to the regional courthouse, busy enough to ensure witnesses yet structured enough to prevent disruptions. The investigative journalist had arrived early, securing a corner booth with sightlines to all entrances and exits. Professional paranoia was a trait they shared. The journalist looked exactly as expected, mid-40s, business casual attire designed to blend rather than stand out, the observant eyes of someone accustomed to looking beyond official narratives. No recording equipment visible, but the notebook and multiple pens suggested old-school documentation methods that couldn't be electronically compromised. The ranger slid into the booth, placing a sealed envelope on the table between them. Everything's documented: coordinates, photographs, facility schematics, historical records, radiation readings. 3 independent copies have been distributed to secured locations. The journalist didn't reach for the envelope immediately. You're taking significant personal risk bringing this forward. The risk already exists. The facility is deteriorating. Containment systems are showing stress fractures. They've been hiding this for decades. Experimental radioactive material that should have been properly disposed of, not buried under a national park. And the body in the Jeep? EPA investigator's colleague, eliminated when he discovered the reactivation. The pattern extends back decades. Anyone who gets close to the truth disappears or has an accident. The journalist finally took the envelope, securing it inside a leather portfolio. I have contacts at 3 national publications, independent science editors who can verify the technical aspects, Congressional Oversight Committee members who've been investigating black budget operations. This goes public in 48 hours, simultaneous release across multiple platforms. The EPA investigator will provide official validation. His documentation is included, along with contact protocols. And you? Once this breaks, they'll know the source. The ranger's weathered face remained impassive. I've been protecting this park for 20 years. That doesn't change because the threat wears a government badge instead of carrying a hunting rifle. The meeting concluded with exchange of secure contact methods and confirmation of the timeline. As the ranger left the diner, he activated the final phase of his contingency plan: electronic distribution of encrypted evidence packages to multiple recipients, environmental protection organizations, independent scientific bodies, international monitoring agencies, and select congressional oversight committees. By the time he returned to his small apartment on the park's eastern boundary, the mechanism was irreversibly in motion. Regardless of what happened to him personally, the truth would emerge. 48 hours later, the ranger stood at his living room window, watching as the story exploded across media platforms with the force of a controlled detonation. His television displayed breaking news banners while his laptop showed similar headlines multiplying across digital outlets. Unauthorized nuclear facility discovered in National Park. Decades-long cover-up of radioactive contamination exposed. Whistleblower reveals secret military research threatening public lands. EPA confirms radiation containment, violations in protected wilderness. The journalist had executed the release with professional precision, ensuring the story couldn't be contained or discredited through its sheer breadth of distribution. Scientific journals published the technical documentation simultaneously, with news outlets carrying the human interest angles. Congressional representatives issued immediate calls for investigation. Environmental organizations mobilized legal responses, and public outrage mounted with each passing hour. By evening, the initial government response had shifted from denial to damage control. The Department of Defense acknowledged historical research activities, while claiming current operations were focused on environmental remediation and public safety. The EPA publicly contradicted this narrative, citing evidence of containment violations and failure to disclose hazardous materials. On the 3rd day, the ranger watched from a distant observation point as the response he'd anticipated finally materialized. A convoy of vehicles, FBI, EPA Hazardous Materials Response, Department of Energy Radiological Emergency Teams, and what appeared to be specialized military units, established perimeter control around the concealed facility. Helicopter activity maintained constant aerial surveillance while technical teams deployed monitoring equipment at established intervals. The operation had all the hallmarks of a professional containment and investigation response, the exact protocol that should have been implemented decades earlier when the experimental materials were first created. Public safety was finally taking precedence over secrecy. As darkness fell across the landscape, the ranger remained at his observation point, watching the organized activity below with complex emotions. Relief predominated. The threat was being addressed. The park would eventually be properly decontaminated, the decades of deception exposed. Yet alongside ran a current of sadness for what had been necessary to reach this point. Lives lost, careers destroyed, trust damaged. The wilderness around him had grown quiet, wildlife sensing the unusual human activity and responding with cautious distance. In time, that too would normalize. The natural world possessed remarkable resilience. Given appropriate protection and respect, it would recover. The ranger packed his observation equipment and began the hike back to his vehicle, moving with the same quiet efficiency that had defined his 20 years of service. Tomorrow would bring investigators to his door, administrative reviews, endless documentation requirements, and likely both commendation and criticism for his actions. But tonight, under the vast canopy of stars that had witnessed countless human dramas played out against the backdrop of enduring wilderness, he found a moment of peace. He had done what was necessary, upheld the oath taken decades before to protect the resources entrusted to his care, regardless of the source of the threat. Some would call him a whistleblower, others a traitor to operational security, but such labels missed the fundamental truth that had guided his actions from the beginning. He was, simply and completely, a guardian of the wilderness, the human sentinel standing between natural systems and the forces that would exploit or endanger them. As he reached his vehicle and turned toward home, the ranger allowed himself a rare moment of professional satisfaction. The park would be protected. The truth had been revealed. The system, however flawed and resistant, had ultimately responded to correct its own failures. It was enough. 3 months after the explosive revelations, the ranger sat across from the lead federal investigator in a temporary field office established at the park's administrative headquarters. The once secret facility had become the center of the largest environmental remediation operation in the region's history, with specialized teams working around the clock to contain, document, and ultimately remove the hazardous materials concealed for decades beneath the wilderness. The containment structure was never designed for long-term storage, the investigator explained, sliding a folder of declassified documents across the table. It was supposed to be temporary until they developed transport protocols for the experimental isotopes. When that proved impossible, they simply buried the problem and classified everything. The ranger reviewed the documents with methodical care, the same approach he had applied to his original investigation. The official findings far exceeded his initial discoveries. Not one but 7 experimental sites scattered throughout the park's remote regions, all connected to Project Cerberus, all containing varying levels of radioactive materials that should have been properly disposed of decades earlier. How many people knew? He asked, his weathered face revealing nothing of the anger he felt at this betrayal of public trust. Operational knowledge was compartmentalized. Most personnel knew only their specific assignments: monitoring radiation levels, maintaining equipment, securing perimeters. But the Oversight Committee, 7 senior military and Department of Energy officials, they knew everything. The investigator's expression hardened. 4 are deceased. 3 are now in federal custody, facing charges of environmental crimes, conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and in 2 cases, accessory to murder. The ranger looked up from the files. The EPA investigator's colleague, and 4 others over the decades. When monitoring technicians or park personnel got too close to the truth, they were eliminated, made to look like accidents or reassigned to positions where they could be controlled. The investigator pushed another file forward. We've identified 17 suspicious deaths or disappearances connected to Project Cerberus since 1972. The revelation settled heavily in the ranger's chest. 17 lives sacrificed to preserve a dangerous secret. 17 families who never received truth or justice. Among the list of victims, he recognized the name of the young deputy's uncle, the park maintenance worker who had discovered monitoring equipment 15 years earlier and subsequently died in an industrial accident. The radiation exposure assessment? The ranger asked, turning to the most immediate concern. Localized but significant. No immediate threat to the broader ecosystem or public health, but the contamination zones will require extensive remediation. Initial estimates suggest a 5-year cleanup operation. The investigator paused. The good news, if you can call it that, is we found no evidence of significant water table contamination. The facility design included redundant groundwater protection systems that apparently functioned as intended. Outside the window, the ranger observed the operational hub that had transformed the park's eastern administrative area. Specialized containment vehicles, decontamination stations, mobile laboratories, and the constant movement of personnel in protective equipment. What had once been a quiet corner of the park now resembled a military base. The truth finally exposed to daylight after decades in shadow. The public response has been unprecedented, The investigator continued. Congressional hearings are scheduled for next month. The Inspector General's office has launched comprehensive reviews of all legacy military sites in national parks and protected lands nationwide. The Department of Energy has established a dedicated task force for identifying and remediating undisclosed radioactive storage facilities. The broader impacts were already evident in the park's daily operations. Visitor centers had been transformed into information hubs where specialized teams explained the situation, addressed public concerns, and outlined remediation plans. Educational programs focused on environmental monitoring had been instituted, transforming a crisis into an opportunity for scientific engagement. Local communities had responded with a complex mixture of emotions: outrage at the decades-long deception, fear regarding potential health impacts, and pride in the park ranger who had exposed the truth despite significant personal risk. Town hall meetings occurred weekly, allowing residents to question officials directly and receive the transparency that had been denied for generations. National media maintained constant coverage, with documentary crews establishing semi-permanent operations to chronicle the cleanup efforts. International environmental organizations had dispatched observers, and several universities had initiated long-term ecological studies to monitor recovery and document remediation techniques for potential application elsewhere. There's something else you should know, the investigator said, closing the official files and leaning forward slightly. The operation went far beyond simple storage. Based on recovered documentation, Project Cerberus was attempting to develop what they termed persistent radiological deterrence, essentially radioactive materials that could be deployed in strategic locations and remain dangerous for decades with minimal maintenance. The ranger absorbed this information silently, its implications cascading through his understanding of what he had uncovered. Cold War thinking at its most dangerous, the investigator continued. The project was officially terminated in 1972, but a small faction within military intelligence continued pursuing the research illegally, using the established infrastructure and black budget allocations diverted through classified channels. And the recent activity, the men I observed at the site? Containment failure triggered automated alerts to systems still being monitored by that same faction. They attempted to address the degradation secretly rather than disclose the program's existence. When your investigation threatened exposure, they resorted to elimination protocols established during the program's active phase. The ranger considered the near miss, how close he had come to becoming another statistical entry in the project's dark history, another accident, conveniently explaining the disappearance of someone who asked too many questions. The congressional investigation will be thorough, the investigator assured him, sensing the direction of his thoughts. Those responsible, not just for the original program but for its illegal continuation and the cover-up attempts, will face justice. This goes beyond environmental crimes into national security violations, misappropriation of federal resources, and homicide. As the briefing concluded, the ranger stepped outside into the autumn afternoon. The season had turned during the months of investigation, summer warmth yielding to the crisp clarity of fall. In the valley below, remediation work continued uninterrupted, the first phase of a healing process that would span years, perhaps decades. The park would recover. Nature possessed remarkable resilience when given opportunity and protection. The invisible wounds might linger in contaminated soil and compromised systems, but with proper care and attention, even these would eventually fade into the background of ecological history. What would never fade, the ranger reflected, was the human cost, the lives lost, the truths concealed, the fundamental betrayal of public trust by those sworn to protect it. Some damages could not be remediated, some losses never truly restored, but the truth, at last, had emerged into the light, and that was a beginning. The ceremony had not been the ranger's idea. In fact, he had attempted to decline the recognition entirely, preferring to return to his regular duties without public acknowledgement. But the park administration, regional government officials, and various environmental organizations had insisted on formal recognition of his actions. Not just for you, the park superintendent had explained, but for what you represent. The public needs to see that individual integrity still matters, that systems can correct themselves when good people stand firm. So the ranger found himself on the temporary platform erected near the park's main visitor center, surrounded by officials in formal attire, facing an assembled crowd of park personnel, local residents, media representatives, and environmental activists. Behind the platform hung a simple banner, Truth, service, protection. The unofficial motto of the Park Service, rendered suddenly profound by recent events. The state governor approached the podium, adjusting the microphone before addressing the assembly. The ranger stood at parade rest, slightly to one side, his standard uniform meticulously pressed for the occasion, but otherwise unchanged. No additional insignia, no visible markers of distinction. His weathered features remained composed, revealing nothing of his discomfort with being the focus of public attention. What defines true service to the public trust? The governor began. Is it blind adherence to institutional directives? Unquestioning loyalty to organizational hierarchy? Or is it something more fundamental? A commitment to the core principles that transcend bureaucracy and politics? The crowd remained silent, but the ranger noted the subtle nodding among his fellow park employees. Men and women who understood the daily tension between procedural requirements and fundamental purpose. For 20 years, the park ranger we honor today upheld his oath through daily actions that rarely made headlines, protecting wilderness, guiding visitors, maintaining the delicate balance between human access and environmental preservation. The public sees the uniform, not the individual sacrifices behind it. The governor gestured toward the mountains visible beyond the ceremony site. 3 months ago, this ranger discovered something that challenged his understanding of the very institution he served. He found evidence that portions of this national treasure had been secretly compromised by the same government sworn to protect it. The ranger's gaze remained fixed on the middle distance, his expression unchanged despite the memories this narration evoked. The military jeep, the body, the hidden facility, the pursuit through wilderness he had sworn to protect. Faced with institutional resistance, official obstruction, and ultimately direct threats to his personal safety, this ranger made the most difficult choice a public servant can face, the decision to challenge the system from within, to place truth above convenience, to risk everything in service to the fundamental mission when the institution itself had faltered. The governor turned slightly, addressing the ranger directly. Your actions remind us that uniforms and badges and titles are merely symbols. True service lies in upholding the principles these symbols represent, even when, especially when, doing so requires standing apart from the very systems that conferred them. The medal presented was simple, a civic commendation for extraordinary service, nothing that would appear exceptional on a formal uniform, but the significance transcended the physical token. This was public acknowledgement that systems require individual conscience to function properly, that oath-keeping sometimes demands rule-breaking. When the ranger finally stepped forward to accept the commendation and address the assembly, his words were characteristically measured and focused. This recognition belongs not to me, but to those who never received justice, he began, his voice steady despite the unaccustomed public speaking. 17 individuals discovered pieces of the truth over decades. 17 lives were cut short to maintain secrecy. They are the true whistleblowers, even if their warnings were silenced before being heard. He acknowledged the families of identified victims seated in the front row, people who had spent decades believing their loved ones died in accidents, now finally receiving confirmation of darker truths and the cold comfort of vindication. Systems fail when secrecy becomes more important than the values they claim to protect. The Park Service exists to preserve natural treasures for future generations. The military exists to defend the nation and its principles. When these missions became corrupted by classified operations that threatened both environmental safety and public trust, the failure was not just operational but moral. The ranger's gaze swept across the assembly, settling briefly on the young deputy who had shared his uncle's notes. A small act of courage that had helped connect crucial pieces of the investigation. This case demonstrates both the worst and best aspects of our institutions. The worst, decades of deception, environmental damage, and lives sacrificed to protect not the public, but the secret itself. The best, when the truth finally emerged, these same institutions mobilized remarkable resources to address the damage, pursue accountability, and establish protections against future abuses. As the ceremony concluded and the crowd dispersed, the ranger found himself approached by family members of those who had died maintaining the secret, the maintenance worker's brother, the disappeared biologist's daughter, the accidentally drowned hydrologist's widow. Their expressions carried the complex mixture of grief renewed and relief finally granted. My brother knew something was wrong out there, the maintenance worker's brother said quietly. For 15 years we thought he was being paranoid before the accident. Thank you for proving he wasn't. The ranger accepted their gratitude with appropriate gravity. understanding that his investigation had provided something perhaps more valuable than justice: validation, the confirmation that their loved ones had not been mistaken, delusional, or reckless, but rather had glimpsed fragments of a truth too dangerous to be acknowledged. Later, standing alone at the ceremony site as cleanup crews dismantled the platform and folded chairs, the ranger contemplated the medal now stored in his pocket rather than displayed. The recognition felt incomplete, even inappropriate. He had merely performed his duty as he understood it. That this had required extraordinary measures reflected the system's failure, not his exceptional virtue. The true cost remained largely invisible to those who had organized the ceremony. The sleepless nights, the persistent hypervigilance, the fractured trust in institutions he had served faithfully for decades. These were private burdens he would continue carrying long after public attention shifted to new concerns. The medal would go into a drawer alongside other accumulated tokens of professional life. The lessons, however, would remain active duty, the understanding that systems require constant vigilance, that true service sometimes demands standing apart from the very institutions that define it. 6 months after the ceremony, the ranger resumed regular patrols in the northwestern section of the park. The remediation operation continued in designated containment zones, but much of the wilderness had been cleared for normal access following comprehensive testing. Life within the Park Service had achieved a new equilibrium: enhanced environmental monitoring protocols, increased transparency in operations, and subtle cultural shifts that encouraged personnel to report concerns without fear of reprisal. The ranger's day-to-day responsibilities remained largely unchanged: maintaining trails, assisting visitors, monitoring wildlife activity, enforcing regulations. Yet his perception had transformed fundamentally. Each familiar vista now carried additional dimensions of understanding, each routine patrol informed by deeper awareness of what lay beneath the visible landscape. His colleagues treated him with a curious mixture of respect and caution, appreciation for his actions combined with uncertainty about how to engage someone who had challenged the system so fundamentally. The ranger neither encouraged nor discouraged this subtle distance, accepting it as an inevitable consequence of his choices. The park superintendent had offered him promotion to administrative roles, positions with greater influence, higher pay, reduced physical demands. The ranger had declined each offer with the same simple explanation: "I belong in the field." His commitment remained to the direct daily work of wilderness protection, not to the bureaucracy that surrounded it. On a clear spring morning, almost exactly 1 year after discovering the military jeep, the ranger parked his vehicle at the small turnout where that fateful patrol had begun. The area had changed significantly. Remediation markers dotted certain sections, monitoring equipment maintained regular assessment of environmental recovery, and subtle security features ensured the contaminated zones remained isolated during treatment. The ranger hiked along now familiar paths, noting the resilience of natural systems even in areas adjacent to contamination. New growth pushed through soil where heavy equipment had disrupted vegetation during the remediation process. Wildlife had returned to territories temporarily abandoned during the most intense human activity. The wilderness was healing itself with characteristic patience. At the ridge overlooking the former facility site, the ranger paused for his personal ritual of remembrance. The concealed entrance had been replaced by a secure containment structure, all pretense of secrecy replaced by transparent operations under continuous monitoring by multiple oversight agencies. Regular public updates detailed the progress of material removal, decontamination procedures, and environmental restoration efforts. From his pack, the ranger removed 17 small stones collected from significant locations throughout the park, one for each identified victim of Project Cerberus. This private memorial, repeated monthly, connected him to the human cost that official reports reduced to statistics and case numbers. He arranged the stones in a small cairn, a temporary monument that weather and wildlife would eventually reclaim, as was appropriate in wilderness. The truth found its way to the surface, he said quietly to the empty air, as it always does, eventually. This unofficial ceremony complete, the ranger continued his patrol, moving with the same methodical efficiency that had defined his 20 years of service. His official report would note environmental conditions, wildlife observations, visitor compliance with regulations and maintenance needs, the routine documentation of a park ranger performing standard duties. What would remain unwritten were his additional observations, the subtle indicators of ecosystem recovery, The gradual return to natural balance in areas formerly disrupted by both the secret facility and its subsequent remediation. These he tracked with personal notation systems, maintaining his own assessment independent of official monitoring. As afternoon shadows lengthened across the landscape, the ranger made a final stop at a remote monitoring station, one of the original locations from the military notebook that had started his investigation. The equipment had been replaced with modern environmental sensors maintained by university research teams, their data publicly accessible through online dashboards. Transparency had replaced secrecy. Scientific inquiry had replaced classified operations. Yet something about the location still troubled him, some element of the original purpose that remained incompletely explained. The official investigation had documented the what and how of Project Cerberus with thorough precision, but the deepest why remained elusive. What had motivated the original researchers to continue such dangerous work in secret? What had they discovered that justified such extraordinary measures to maintain confidentiality? The ranger suspected some answers remained buried in still classified files, some truths deemed too sensitive even for the congressional investigations and public hearings. Perhaps future generations would uncover these final pieces, or perhaps some secrets would remain permanently interred in bureaucratic vaults. What mattered was that the immediate danger had been addressed, the environmental damage was being remediated, and those responsible faced appropriate consequences. The system, however imperfectly, had corrected itself when confronted with irrefutable evidence. For a park ranger dedicated to protecting wilderness for future generations, that represented sufficient victory. The following morning broke with the same golden light spilling through towering pines that had marked the beginning of this journey 1 year earlier. The ranger stood at the small outpost station, preparing for another day of patrol with the familiar routine that anchored his service. Coffee poured into the battered thermos, equipment checked with methodical precision, radio protocols verified. Yet subtle differences revealed the transformation wrought by intervening events. The radiation detector now standard issue for all park personnel. The enhanced environmental monitoring protocols integrated into routine reporting. The additional layers of oversight ensuring that never again could portions of public land be secretly appropriated for classified operations. The ranger moved through his morning preparations with the same economy of motion that had always characterized him, but his awareness had expanded beyond the visible landscape to include its hidden dimensions, the invisible legacies of human activities that lingered beneath the surface, the complex interplay between institutional systems and the natural world they imperfectly managed. Stepping outside, he performed the same assessment of environmental conditions that had begun that fateful patrol: temperature, wind direction, moisture levels, wildlife activity. Everything was as it should be, the wilderness functioning according to natural rhythms despite the human dramas that had played out against its backdrop. The truth, like water, eventually finds its path to the surface. It may be diverted, contained, even temporarily prevented from flowing, but its essential nature compels movement toward revelation. Some truths emerge with destructive force when artificially constrained too long. Others seep gradually through barriers designed to contain them, revealing themselves in patterns recognizable only to those paying proper attention. A park ranger's fundamental duty remains constant regardless of what uniform they wear or what agency they represent: to protect the resources entrusted to their care, to preserve natural systems for future generations, to stand as sentinel between wilderness and the forces that would compromise its integrity. Sometimes this requires confronting not just individual violations, but institutional failures, challenging not just external threats, but internal corruptions. The ranger secured his gear and entered the park vehicle, ready to begin another day of seemingly routine patrol that was, in reality, vital stewardship. The wilderness stretched before him, resilient, enduring, indifferent to human classifications, yet vulnerable to human actions. His role remained unchanged despite all that had occurred: to observe, to protect, to maintain the delicate balance between human presence and natural preservation. The vehicle moved forward along the gravel road, carrying its solitary occupant toward another day of quiet guardianship. One person, properly attentive and sufficiently determined, had altered the course of institutional history and ensured environmental protection. The lesson remained clear for anyone who might one day view this account of events that began with an accidental discovery and culminated in fundamental transformation. Truth requires witnesses willing to testify regardless of consequences. Systems require individuals who value integrity above institutional loyalty. Wilderness requires guardians who recognize that protection sometimes means challenging the very authorities who established the protections. The ranger drove toward the morning sun, returning to the essential work that had always defined his purpose, regardless of what revelations might yet emerge from the shadows. Don't forget to subscribe for more thrilling true stories from American wilderness and the brave individuals who protect it.